The rancher left his too-fat bride in an empty ranch. When he returned, he found the home he needed. The summer evening spread across the Wyoming Territory like liquid gold poured from heaven's own hands. Heat lingered above the prairie long after the sun had begun its slow descent, turning distant hills into wavering shadows beneath a sky painted in amber and copper. Grass rolled endlessly toward the horizon, bending beneath warm winds that carried the scent of sagebrush and dust. Cicadas sang from the cottonwoods lining a dry creek bed, their voices weaving through the stillness like a lonely hymn. It was the kind of evening that made a person believe the world was vast enough to swallow every sorrow whole. Sadie Callahan sat beside the stagecoach window and watched that endless land pass by. The fading sunlight softened the reflection staring back at her from the glass, but it could not erase the years she carried behind her eyes. At 29, she had grown accustomed to being looked at before she was spoken to. People noticed her size before they noticed anything else. They noticed it before her kindness, before her patience, before the careful way she listened when others spoke, before the strength hidden beneath layers of disappointment. She folded her hands tightly in her lap and glanced at the letter tucked inside her worn traveling bag. The paper had become soft from being read too many times. Wyatt Mercer, a rancher, 38 years old, owner of a cattle ranch outside the small town of Cotton Creek, seeking a practical wife. The words had once felt like a doorway. Now they felt like a gamble. The coach rocked over a rut and Sadie looked back toward the prairie. 3 months earlier, she had answered Wyatt's advertisement because there seemed little left for her where she had been living. Her father was gone. Her mother was gone. The relatives who remained considered her a burden they tolerated rather than loved. Every church social ended the same way. Men smiled politely before choosing someone prettier, someone smaller, someone easier to admire. Eventually, pity became more painful than rejection. So when Wyatt's letter arrived, she chose hope. Hope, she had learned, was sometimes the bravest thing a lonely person could carry. As dusk settled over the land, the stagecoach finally rolled into Cotton Creek. The town appeared small against the enormous sky. A handful of buildings lined the dusty street. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, a church with white paint fading beneath years of weather. People moved along the boardwalks while horses waited beside hitching rails. Sadie stepped down from the coach and immediately spotted the man standing near the station. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, sun-weathered. Everything about him seemed carved from the land itself. Wyatt Mercer removed his hat. His gray eyes met hers. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face. Not cruelty, not disgust, something quieter, disappointment. The expression vanished almost immediately, but Sadie saw it. Years of experience had taught her how to recognize disappointment before anyone spoke a word. "Miss Callahan?" he asked. His voice was deep and restrained. She forced a smile. "Yes." Wyatt nodded. "Long trip." It was. Silence followed. The awkwardness settled between them like dust. Finally, Wyatt picked up her suitcase. "We should get going." The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour. The sun disappeared completely. Stars emerged one by one across the vast darkness. Neither of them spoke much. Sadie tried several times. She asked about the ranch, the cattle, the weather. Wyatt answered politely, but his replies rarely lasted more than a sentence. Each mile made the distance between them feel greater. The ranch finally appeared beneath moonlight. A weathered house stood behind sagging fences. A barn leaned slightly toward one side. The place looked tired. Not ruined, just lonely, like a man who had spent too many years speaking only to himself. The wedding happened 2 days later. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. A preacher, a few witnesses, no celebration, no music, no flowers. Only practical vows exchanged beneath a cloudless sky. Sadie told herself practical things could still become beautiful. Yet whispers followed her before the ink on the marriage certificate had dried. The women gathered outside the general store watched openly. Men lowered their voices when she passed. Their curiosity carried sharp edges. Veronica Hale arrived before sunset. She stepped from a polished carriage wearing a pale green dress that looked far too elegant for Cotton Creek. Beautiful, confident, the kind of woman who had never doubted her reflection. She approached Sadie with a smile that never reached her eyes. "So you're Wyatt's bride?" Sadie nodded. Veronica looked her up and down, slowly, carefully, the way people inspected livestock before deciding whether it was worth purchasing. "Well," Veronica said softly, "that certainly surprised everyone." The remark sounded harmless. The laughter from her companions did not. Sadie felt heat rise into her cheeks. Veronica smiled wider. Then she walked away. The wound she left behind lingered long after her footsteps disappeared. That night, Sadie sat alone on the porch while Wyatt worked in the barn. Crickets filled the darkness. The moon hung low above distant hills. She listened to the quiet and wondered whether she had mistaken loneliness for courage. The following morning, Wyatt entered the kitchen before sunrise. His expression seemed unusually tense. A folded map rested beneath one arm. Sadie sensed trouble immediately. "I'm leaving today," he said. She stared at him. "Leaving? A cattle drive? For how long?" He hesitated. "Several months." The word struck harder than she expected. Several months. She had been his wife for less than 3 days. "You just got home," she said quietly. "I know. Can't someone else lead it?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Sadie lowered her eyes. She understood more than he realized. This wasn't only about cattle. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. "The ranch will provide everything you need." The statement sounded practical. Generous even, yet it felt strangely similar to goodbye. Neither mentioned the truth hanging between them. He had expected someone else. Someone prettier. Someone easier to love. When Wyatt rode away that afternoon, dust followed him down the road until horse and rider disappeared into the shimmering distance. The silence that remained felt enormous. Sadie stood alone in the yard. The wind moved through dry grass. A loose shutter rattled against the house. Nearby fences leaned crookedly. The garden lay abandoned beneath weeds. Inside, dust-coated forgotten furniture. The ranch seemed less like a home and more like a place waiting to be given up. She walked slowly through each room. Every creaking floorboard echoed. Every empty corner reminded her she had been left behind. By sunset, storm clouds gathered along the western horizon. Lightning flickered far away, illuminating the prairie in brief silver flashes. Sadie carried a lantern onto the porch and sat watching darkness swallow the land. Tears threatened more than once. She refused them. People had spent years telling her she was unwanted. She would not spend another year proving them right. Her gaze drifted across the neglected ranch. The broken fences, the dying garden, the lonely house. Then something unexpected stirred inside her. Not anger, not despair. Determination. The same stubborn strength that had carried her through every humiliation. Another flash of lightning illuminated the property, and for the first time she noticed something Wyatt had never seen. Beneath the weeds, the garden still held life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, refusing to surrender. Sadie rose from the porch, stepped into the wind, and stared at those fragile signs of survival while thunder rolled across the distant prairie. Then she whispered into the gathering storm, "If this place is all I've been given, I'll make it bloom." And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, entirely unaware of the promise she had just made, Wyatt Mercer continued riding away from the very thing that might one day save him. Summer settled fully over the prairie in the weeks that followed, stretching long golden days across the Wyoming Territory. Dawn arrived in pale ribbons of pink and amber, spilling over distant hills before sliding gently across the Mercer Ranch. The mornings smelled of warm earth and sage. Meadowlarks perched on fence posts and filled the air with song. Even the wind seemed softer now, carrying whispers through the grass instead of loneliness. Yet every sunrise also reminded Sadie Callahan that she was still alone. The first week tested her resolve. The second tested her strength. By the third, she understood that survival would require both. Each morning she rose before daylight and tied her apron beneath the fading stars. She swept floors buried beneath years of dust. She scrubbed windows until sunlight could finally enter the house unhindered. She mended curtains, repaired shelves, hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached. No one praised her. No one thanked her. The work simply needed doing. That was enough. One afternoon she stood in the abandoned garden Wyatt had neglected for years. Weeds reached nearly to her knees. Rocks littered the soil. The summer heat pressed against her skin while sweat dampened her collar. Most people would have walked away. Sadie picked up a shovel. Day after day she worked beneath the sun. She cleared weeds, turned soil, planted beans, squash, onions, and potatoes. By the end of the month, green shoots began pushing upward from the earth. Whenever she saw them, something stirred inside her. Perhaps she wasn't so different from those plants. Both had been overlooked. Both had been expected to fail. Both continued growing anyway. The ranch slowly changed. The porch looked cleaner. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread instead of dust. The chicken coop held new hens purchased with money Sadie earned selling hand-sewn linens. Life began returning to places that had long forgotten it existed. The town noticed. Unfortunately, so did Veronica Hale. Sadie encountered her one morning at the general store. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Several women stood near the counter. Their conversation stopped immediately. Veronica glanced toward Sadie and smiled. "Goodness," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like ranch life agrees with some people more than others." A few women laughed. Sadie knew exactly what the remark meant. Her size remained the easiest thing for people to discuss. For a moment the familiar sting returned. The old shame. The old humiliation. Then Evelyn Hart stepped from behind the counter. The widow's gray eyes narrowed. "If kindness grew as easily as vegetables," she said coolly, "this town might actually improve." The laughter died instantly. Veronica's smile tightened. Sadie looked at Evelyn in surprise. The older woman simply shrugged. "Ignore fools," she said. "They get lonely when nobody listens." It was a small moment. Yet it stayed with Sadie long after she left. Because kindness, she realized, often arrived quietly. Not as grand rescue. Not as dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrived as a single person refusing to laugh. As summer deepened, Sadie became increasingly familiar with the rhythms of Cotton Creek. She delivered vegetables to elderly neighbors, shared eggs with struggling families, helped mend clothing for children whose parents could not afford replacements. People slowly began seeing her. Not her size. Not the rumors. Her. The change was subtle at first. A greeting where there had once been silence. A smile where there had once been judgment. Respect grew slowly like roots beneath soil. Then Luke Mercer arrived. The 17-year-old rode onto the property one hot afternoon in a cloud of dust. Tall and lean, with dark hair and guarded eyes, he looked remarkably similar to Wyatt. Sadie met him near the barn. "You must be Luke." His expression remained unreadable. "You must be the mail-order wife." The words carried no warmth, only suspicion. Sadie offered a hand. He ignored it. "I'll be staying a while." She lowered her hand. "There's a room ready." Luke glanced toward the house. "Uncle Wyatt really married you?" The question landed harder than he intended. Perhaps harder than he knew. Still, Sadie smiled gently. "Last time I checked." Luke looked away first. Over the following days, his distrust became impossible to miss. He rarely spoke. Ate meals quickly. Avoided conversation whenever possible. Sadie understood. People who had lost too much often protected themselves with distance. She knew because she had done the same thing for years. One evening she discovered him sitting alone behind the barn, staring at a book. Or rather, pretending to stare at it. The pages had not turned once. Sadie sat several feet away. Neither spoke for a while. Finally she asked, "What's the story about?" Luke shifted uncomfortably. "Don't know." "You haven't read it?" His jaw tightened. Embarrassment flashed across his face. The truth appeared instantly. He couldn't read. "I never learned properly," he muttered. The admission sounded painful. As though he expected ridicule. Sadie offered none. "My father couldn't read much either." Luke looked surprised. "He couldn't?" "No." Silence lingered. Then she asked softly, "Want me to teach you?" Luke stared at the dirt. Several long seconds passed. Finally he nodded. That was how it began. Not with friendship. Not trust. Simply two people sitting beneath a fading sky while words slowly revealed themselves on a page. The lessons continued throughout the summer. Luke learned quickly. Sadie never mocked mistakes. Never rushed him. Never treated ignorance as weakness. Gradually the walls around him began lowering. He helped repair fences. She taught him bookkeeping. He carried water for the garden. She baked extra biscuits whenever he spent long days working. Small gestures accumulated, like stones building a path. Meanwhile the ranch continued transforming. Vegetables flourished. The chicken flock doubled. The house felt brighter. Laughter occasionally drifted from open windows. Even Luke smiled now and then. One evening they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the prairie gold. Luke held a newspaper. Carefully. Proudly. He read several sentences aloud without stumbling. When he finished, surprise crossed his face. "I did it." Sadie smiled. "You certainly did." For a moment he looked younger than 17. Almost like a boy discovering possibility for the first time. Then autumn-colored clouds gathered along the horizon, though summer still lingered. Luke folded the newspaper. His expression became thoughtful. "You know," he said quietly, "people talk about you. Sadie's stomach tightened. She knew what usually followed those words. Luke continued. They say you saved this place. Emotion caught unexpectedly in her throat. Nobody had ever described her that way. Not once. Before she could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the road. A rider approached through the fading sunlight. Marshal Reed Donovan reined in near the gate. His normally calm face carried unusual concern. Drought's getting worse west of town, he said. Several families are running out of food. Sadie glanced toward her overflowing garden. Rows of vegetables stretched beneath the evening sky. Months of labor stood before her. The harvest represented security, the first real success she had known in years. She looked toward the distant horizon where struggling homesteads waited, then back toward the garden, then toward Luke. Without hesitation she said, "Let's start loading wagons." The marshal stared at her. Luke stared too. Neither spoke. But as twilight settled across the prairie, both men suddenly saw something Wyatt Mercer had failed to recognize before riding away. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sadie felt something even more precious than acceptance. She felt necessary. Autumn arrived quietly across the Wyoming Territory, slipping into the prairie on cool morning winds that carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. The endless fields that had glowed emerald through summer now shimmered in shades of amber and gold. Cottonwoods along the creek blushed yellow beneath the widening sky. Migrating birds crossed overhead in dark ribbons, heading south before winter claimed the land. The season felt like a pause between heartbeats, a moment suspended between what had been and what was still waiting to become. Sadie stood in the garden before sunrise, gathering onions into a basket. The harvest had exceeded every expectation. Vegetables filled the cellar. The chicken coop overflowed with healthy hens. Fresh paint brightened the house. Strong fences enclosed the property. Nothing about the Mercer ranch resembled the neglected place she had first encountered. Sometimes she walked through the yard and barely recognized it herself. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Wyatt Mercer was still gone. Though she rarely admitted it aloud, she had stopped wondering whether he missed the ranch. Instead, she occasionally wondered whether he would recognize it when he returned. The answer arrived 3 days later. The afternoon was calm and bright when Luke spotted a rider approaching from the southern trail. He was repairing a gate when he suddenly straightened. A familiar silhouette emerged from the haze. Horse. Broad shoulders. For a moment Luke simply stared. Then he dropped his hammer. He's back. Sadie's hands froze around a basket of squash. The word settled strangely inside her chest. Months earlier she had dreaded his return. Now she found herself unexpectedly nervous. By the time Wyatt reached the yard, Luke was already crossing toward him. The reunion between uncle and nephew was brief. Neither man displayed emotion easily. Yet relief softened Wyatt's weathered features. Then his gaze lifted toward the ranch. His horse slowed. He looked toward the repaired barn. The flourishing garden. The fresh white curtains visible through polished windows. The fence standing straight and strong. Confusion crossed his face. For several long moments he simply stared. Luke folded his arms. Told you it'd surprise you. Wyatt dismounted slowly. What happened here? Sadie stepped forward before Luke could answer. The basket remained tucked against her hip. Welcome home. The simple greeting seemed to startle him more than anything else. His eyes met hers. For the first time since their wedding, disappointment was absent. Instead there was uncertainty. And something else. Something he appeared unwilling to name. Over the following days Wyatt struggled to hide his astonishment. Everywhere he looked, evidence of Sadie's work surrounded him. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread. The garden produced more food than many neighboring farms. The livestock appeared healthier. Even the house itself felt different. Warmer. Lived in. Alive. One morning he opened a ledger and discovered detailed records tracking every expense and profit. The handwriting belonged to Sadie. The numbers were precise, organized, thoughtful. He stared at the pages longer than necessary. The woman he had abandoned was proving herself capable in ways he had never imagined. Meanwhile Luke seemed determined to ensure Wyatt noticed every improvement. At supper he spoke openly about Sadie's efforts. How she repaired fences, shared harvests, taught him reading, helped struggling families during the drought. Each story deepened Wyatt's silence. Guilt settled upon him like an unwelcome shadow. One evening he wandered into the garden as sunset painted the prairie gold. Sadie was gathering carrots. The wind tugged loose strands of hair across her face. Neither spoke immediately. The quiet felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally Wyatt knelt beside a row of vegetables. You did all this yourself? Not entirely. He raised an eyebrow. Luke helped. A smile touched Wyatt's mouth. That explains the crooked section over there. Sadie laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised them both. For a brief moment the distance between them seemed smaller. The days that followed brought more moments like that. Shared breakfasts before dawn. Conversations while mending equipment. Quiet companionship during evening chores. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand declarations. No sudden transformations. Trust simply began growing where emptiness had once existed. Wyatt noticed things he had previously overlooked. The way Sadie remembered every neighbor's struggles. The patience she showed Luke. The calm confidence beneath her gentle nature. He found himself watching her more often than he intended. One afternoon she carried sacks of feed across the yard. Before he might have noticed only her size. Now he noticed her determination. Her resilience. The countless ways she had strengthened everything she touched. The realization unsettled him. Because it forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had judged her before he truly knew her. And he was beginning to regret it deeply. Unfortunately, not everyone shared his growing admiration. Veronica Hale noticed the changes immediately. She had expected Wyatt's return to expose Sadie's shortcomings. Instead she watched townspeople praise the woman she despised. The situation became unbearable. The Harvest Social offered the perfect opportunity to correct it. The annual gathering drew nearly every family in Cotton Creek. Lanterns hung from wooden beams. Music drifted across the square. Children laughed between booths displaying produce and crafts. Sadie arrived wearing a simple burgundy dress she had sewn herself. She expected little attention. Instead people greeted her warmly. Several families thanked her for helping during the drought. Others complimented her preserves. The kindness felt unfamiliar. Almost fragile. Then Veronica arrived. The atmosphere shifted immediately. She approached surrounded by admirers. Elegant. Confident. Dangerous. Her smile appeared pleasant enough. Her words were not. I suppose charity work makes quite the impression, Veronica said loudly. Though some people seem eager to forget certain standards. Conversations nearby quieted. Sadie recognized the trap. Veronica wanted a public humiliation. She wanted whispers. Laughter. Shame. The old fears stirred within Sadie. For a moment she felt like the lonely woman stepping from the stagecoach months earlier. Then Wyatt appeared beside her. His presence alone changed the room. Veronica's smile tightened. Surely you remember what this town once expected of you, Wyatt? He looked directly at her. I do. Hope flashed across Veronica's face. Then Wyatt continued. And I'm grateful those expectations were wrong. Silence swept through the gathering. Even the music seemed distant. Veronica stared. So that's your choice? Wyatt's expression hardened. My choice is treating people with respect. The words landed with remarkable force. Because everyone understood what he meant. He wasn't merely defending Sadie. He was standing beside her. Publicly. Deliberately. For the first time. Veronica turned and walked away before anyone could witness the humiliation in her eyes. The crowd slowly returned to conversation. Yet something important had changed. Sadie felt it immediately. Not because Wyatt had rescued her. She had long since learned to survive without rescue. What mattered was that someone had finally chosen to stand beside her when walking away would have been easier. Later that night they sat together on the porch. The celebration had ended. Moonlight silvered the prairie. Crickets sang softly beyond the yard. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence felt rich rather than empty. Wyatt leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I owe you an apology. Sadie looked toward him. For what? He laughed quietly. For a very long list. She studied his face. The proud rancher who had once seemed unreachable suddenly appeared tired. Honest. Human. I wasn't fair to you, he admitted. The confession lingered between them. Sadie could hear sincerity beneath every word. Yet before either could say more, hoofbeats echoed from the road. A rider approached rapidly through the darkness. Marshal Reed Donovan emerged beneath the lantern light. His expression was unusually grave. The moment he dismounted, Sadie sensed trouble. The marshal removed his hat and looked directly at Wyatt. There's something you need to know, he said. Wyatt rose slowly. What happened? Reed's eyes shifted briefly toward Sadie before returning to Wyatt. The trouble with Veronica Hale isn't over. The wind stirred across the prairie as silence settled over the porch, and for reasons she could not explain, Sadie suddenly felt as though the happiness she had spent months building was standing at the edge of something dangerous, waiting for the first crack to appear. The next morning arrived beneath a ceiling of low gray clouds that drifted across the prairie like unsettled thoughts no one could escape. The wind carried the sharp scent of approaching rain and rattled the cottonwoods along the creek. Sadie felt the change before anyone spoke of it. Some storms announced themselves with thunder, others arrived disguised as whispers. Wyatt spent the morning repairing tack in the barn while Luke stacked firewood near the house. Yet an uneasy tension followed them all three through every task and every glance that day, as though the ranch itself sensed trouble drawing near. By noon Marshal Reed Donovan rode into the yard carrying a leather folder beneath his arm. His expression held none of the easy calm that usually accompanied him. Wyatt met him beside the porch and listened as the marshal unfolded several documents across a weathered table. Sadie remained nearby, unable to ignore the concern darkening both men's faces. Reed explained that Veronica had discovered irregularities within old county records. The clerk who handled Wyatt's marriage license had died months earlier, leaving behind paperwork that could be questioned, manipulated, or challenged in court by anyone determined enough to cause harm now. Veronica had already filed a petition claiming the marriage was invalid and that Sadie possessed no legal right to remain on the property. She argued that a missing witness signature rendered the certificate defective. The claim sounded ridiculous, yet Reed warned that rumors often traveled faster than truth. If enough people believed the accusation, pressure could force a hearing before winter. Sadie listened quietly while disappointment settled inside her. She had spent months transforming the ranch and earning respect, yet a few sheets of paper suddenly threatened everything. Old wounds reopened with painful familiarity once again for her weary heart. News spread through Cotton Creek before sunset. Conversation stopped when Sadie entered stores. Curious eyes followed her along boardwalks. Some townspeople defended her without hesitation, remembering the food she had shared during drought. Others retreated into uncertainty. Gossip thrived wherever certainty weakened. Veronica encouraged every whisper. She suggested that Sadie had deliberately trapped Wyatt into marriage. She hinted that the improvements on the ranch had been part of some calculated scheme. The lies were absurd, but repetition gave them weight. Sadie discovered that rebuilding a reputation could take months while damaging one required only minutes on a careless afternoon today. That evening Sadie stood alone in the garden where autumn vegetables crowded the dark soil. Lantern light glowed from the house behind her, yet she felt strangely distant from its warmth. Months earlier she had arrived believing she possessed nothing. Then she built something meaningful with her own hands. Now the possibility of losing it hurt far more than the loneliness she once carried. Wyatt found her among the rows of cabbage and carrots. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt heavy with unfinished truths. Finally he asked whether she was frightened by everything happening around them this week. Sadie considered the question carefully. Then she admitted that fear was not the hardest part. The hardest part was recognizing how quickly people were willing to believe she did not belong. Wyatt lowered his gaze. He understood because he had once shared similar assumptions. For the first time he confessed how disappointed he had been when she stepped from the stagecoach. The honesty stung, yet she appreciated it more than comforting lies. He apologized without excuses. When he finished speaking, the wind shifted through the garden and carried away a small portion of their distance that had lingered between them. The following days brought mounting uncertainty. Reed traveled repeatedly to the county seat searching for records that could disprove Veronica's claim. Luke reacted with open anger. He confronted anyone repeating rumors and nearly started a fight outside the blacksmith shop. Sadie persuaded him to stop before trouble worsened. She reminded him that dignity often required greater courage than retaliation. Though he reluctantly agreed, his frustration remained obvious. He had come to see her as family. The thought of losing her awakened old fears of abandonment. Those fears made every passing day feel longer than the last for the young man. 3 nights later Sadie made a decision. After everyone had gone to bed, she packed several dresses, a sewing kit, and the few possessions she truly considered hers. If a court battle erupted, she refused to become the reason Wyatt's life unraveled. Leaving would spare him public embarrassment and protect the ranch from prolonged conflict. She folded each item carefully and placed it inside a suitcase. The task felt heartbreakingly familiar. Throughout her life she had learned how to leave places where she was unwanted. The habit returned now with devastating ease despite all her recent happiness and hard-won. Luke discovered the packed suitcase before dawn. He stared at it, then at Sadie as understanding flooded his face. The expression that followed broke her heart. He looked like a child preparing to lose someone important again. He demanded to know why she intended to leave. When she explained, he refused to accept the reasoning. He argued that the ranch belonged to her as much as anyone. He insisted that she had earned every board, fence, and harvest through labor. Tears filled his eyes before he could hide them. That alone nearly changed her mind completely in that painful moment. Before the conversation could continue, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Reed dismounted and hurried toward the house carrying fresh evidence. Exhaustion lined his face, but determination brightened his eyes. He had located the retired deputy who recorded marriages during that period. The elderly man remembered Wyatt and Sadie clearly. More importantly, he possessed a duplicate ledger proving the ceremony had been legally documented. Reed explained that the original clerk had accidentally misplaced one signature while copying records. The marriage itself remained valid. Relief swept through the room, yet Reed warned that Veronica's deception extended far beyond paperwork they now knew. According to the deputy, Veronica had visited weeks earlier seeking access to archived documents. She deliberately photographed incomplete pages while ignoring records that corrected the errors. Her goal had never been truth. She wanted leverage. She wanted Sadie humiliated and removed. Wyatt's jaw tightened as Reed revealed the details. Anger flickered behind his eyes, though it was directed primarily at himself. Had he valued Sadie openly from the beginning, Veronica's accusations might never have gained traction. He finally understood that neutrality often helped cruelty survive. Remaining silent had consequences. He intended to remain silent no longer from this day forward. The confrontation arrived sooner than expected. A violent storm rolled across the territory the very next afternoon. Black clouds swallowed the sky. Rain hammered rooftops and transformed roads into rivers of mud. Wind bent trees until branches snapped. Amid the chaos, word reached town that the old bridge west of Cotton Creek had partially collapsed. Several families returning from market were stranded near rising water. Panic spread quickly. Reed organized volunteers. Wyatt saddled horses. Luke loaded ropes and blankets. Without hesitation, Sadie joined them. The danger outside felt real, immediate, and strangely simpler than malicious rumors ever had to face. The river had swollen into a furious torrent by the time they arrived. Rain blurred visibility and turned the landscape into shifting gray shadows. On the far bank, frightened families huddled together while water climbed steadily around them. Among them were several children. Their cries carried through the storm. Wyatt and the others began securing ropes, but conditions worsened with every minute. Sadie noticed a narrow route along higher ground leading toward the trapped group. Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed a safety line and started forward through the driving rain toward the stranded families alone without hesitation whatsoever. What followed unfolded like fragments of lightning. Sadie reached the families and helped secure frightened children to guide ropes. Wyatt crossed after her despite the danger. Together they moved people one by one toward safety. Twice the current nearly knocked them down. Once a terrified boy slipped from his footing and disappeared into rushing water. Sadie lunged instinctively, catching his arm before the river could carry him away. Volunteers pulled them both back. By the time the final family reached solid ground, everyone present had witnessed extraordinary courage. No rumor could survive such evidence of character before their very eyes. When the storm finally weakened, townspeople gathered beneath the dripping awning of the general store. Reed presented the duplicate ledger and the deputy's statement. Veronica's deception unraveled in full view of the community. Shame replaced the confidence she usually carried. Then Wyatt stepped forward. Rain still clung to his coat as he faced the crowd and spoke plainly. He admitted that the greatest mistake had been his own. He had abandoned a woman whose worth surpassed his understanding. Turning toward Sadie, he asked her to stay, not from obligation but from love. She smiled and said yes at long last.